Hello, welcome to another episode of Mobile Technology Spotlight, sponsored by Samsung Electronics of America and proudly presented by Public Safety Insight. Samsung is committed to supporting public safety and helping first responders to use technology as a force multiplier. I'm Dale Stockton. Today we'll be talking with Dan Gomez, who retired as a lieutenant from Los Angeles Police Department after more than 27 years of service. He's a co-founder and current chief technology officer at TechLogix, a company that helps technology companies understand the needs of public safety. And Dan's with us today because he's a recognized thought leader when it comes to effectively leveraging technology, especially mobile technology, as a force multiplier of first responders. He is one of the original members of the Samsung Law Enforcement Advisory Council, and he continues to serve on the council today. So Dan, thanks so much for being with us. And I know you've been actively involved in tech efforts since I first met you probably 15 years ago or more. Could you share a little insight as to how you got started in law enforcement and then transitioning into what led to your tech role at LAPD?
Thanks, Dale. And I really appreciate all the efforts you put into these podcasts. I find them really informative. Encourage everybody to subscribe. As for tech, like everybody else, I came on to law enforcement as a calling. I felt the need to serve. I wanted to serve. I wanted to be part of something greater than myself. And like every new police officer, I was just anxious to go out and be in the field and try to make a difference. And my career took a lot of turns. And the next thing I knew, I was asked by LAPD Command to try to solve an ongoing crime problem in an area called MacArthur Park in a division called the Rampart Division. And a bunch of traditional ways have been implemented in policing and trying to reduce crime and the fear of crime. And it was kind of that reoccurring cycle where we would stop it for a little while, but the moment the resources had to go somewhere else, crime came back. So that was really the first time that I was asked with a team to look at, well, how can we implement technology to solve that problem? And that was kind of my intro into technology. And I asked a lot of questions. I read a lot. And I was willing to take risks, and I had a command that allowed me to take some risks. And we implemented a proactive video surveillance system and eventually introduced LPR into the area. And that's how we started with a kind of a tech-heavy approach to solving and augmenting police officers to be able to reduce crime in an area. And it was very successful. And from that, it just kept expanding. I kept learning more and implementing and finding new and emerging technologies to apply to law enforcement.
Very cool. I think that's the era in which I first connected with you when you were involved with LPR, and you were definitely one of those folks in the country people sought for answers. So looking back over your career, you've done a lot of tech. So what's the tech-related effort that you're the most proud of, and why?
That's a great question. I think that what I'm most proud of, I guess, is, the teams that we put together, it was never really solely about the tech. It was how do we find technology that can help the officer, that can help the community. And if anything else, I feel like during my time at LAPD and even after, the programs that we were involved in, and you and I, Dale, have had many conversations about technology, it really started to influence how other agencies asked for technology, interacted with companies, and even really how companies started, hopefully, to look inward and say, hey, what are we offering to law enforcement? Are we telling them, hey, we found the next best thing? Or I think somewhere in that development cycle, they started asking, how can we help you? I think that was probably the most I'm proud of, is that occurred for companies to say, here, tell me what you need versus here, this is what I think you need. And I think that was a big shift at the time.
That whole thing of getting the companies to ask you for input, that's actually a nice segue to the next question. I'm pretty sure you worked with some of the major car manufacturers regarding tow car design and features inside. Could you share a little bit regarding those experiences?
During the kind of the early 2000s, we started to tackle a project where we looked at the police vehicle and say, well, why do we do this? Why do we have all this equipment? Why do we put it where we put it? And the question kind of came up, well, that's the way we always do it. It didn't make a lot of sense, both from practical, how I use the equipment every day in a police vehicle, to how safe it is, to the type and the expense that we were putting into the car. So we basically dismantled the vehicle and started working with a lot of equipment providers And what we found is if we really want to change in the vehicle, it wasn't the equipment providers that we needed to influence. We needed to influence the manufacturers of the vehicles. And it was during that time when some of the major car manufacturers were either pulling back on production of police vehicles, and some manufacturers were starting to reintroduce, like the Chevy Caprice got reintroduced during that time period. So we were just fortunate that I was able to connect with those manufacturers, convince them that there was a real need to modify their vehicles in a way that would be more conducive for police. And we spoke two different languages. We spoke the police language, which was the need that we needed in public safety, but we also spoke their need, which was, how do I make money off of this? How do I handle this from a business? Is there a crossover into my other non-public safety related police lines? And once we were able to bridge that gap with them, we found that the manufacturers, for instance, of the Chevy Caprice, were willing to work with us. And that vehicle was being exported over from Australia and being reintroduced into the US market. Once we created a proof of concept with those vehicles, then the next major manufacturer wanted to talk to us, which was Dodge. And then once we started a project with Dodge, Ford came knocking on our door. And in the end, ultimately everybody wins because competition, again, within the major manufacturers, it helps improve all the vehicles and then also helps drive the cost down for all public safety.
Yeah, I like that very last sentence. Your efforts really did ripple across the country in terms of some of the patrol car designs. So let's shift towards the mobile tech side for a little bit. I know you had a major role, I might even say the primary role, in the deployment of smartphones and body-worn cameras at LAPD. Could you provide an overview of what that entails and the scope, the size of the project? LAPD is one of the biggest agencies in the country, obviously, so that alone presents a challenge.
This effort really was in advance of kind of the big push toward body cameras. I think, again, my role within the organization was to look at new and emerging technology. And I think collectively, the organization recognized that body cameras were going to be an effective way of collecting evidence within an organization. And we started to look at that. And this is really pre-Ferguson. This was really about how do we introduce a technology into the department that would complement, say, our in-car video project and our LPR project and our CCTV project, which were already in place. So the department itself is about 10,000 officers at the time and sworn members of the department with about 3,000 civilian support staff. In addition to that, the city of Los Angeles is 465 square miles, servicing about 4 million residents. So with that, we wanted to make sure that as we went down the body camera path, that we could deploy body cameras to the entire patrol force, which was roughly about 7,200 body cameras. But beyond that, we really saw that as an opportunity to pair every deployable body camera with a deployable smartphone for a variety of reasons. One is that we had a larger vision within the organization of having what we call the connected officer approach to policing. The body cameras were a start to that. Along with that smartphone, officers could receive data in the field because traditionally the organization only provided smartphones to command staff and specialized units. This was really a shift because we were such a large organization to be able to put that in the hands of the officers who, let's just be frank, are doing the hard work every day within an organization. So by pairing the two together, we could now look for applications that would help officers be informed in the field. We would give them a smartphone that would allow them to input data specifically related to the body cameras, like, for instance, what kind of event they were on. That helps for finding information later, that would help for retention. And there's just a lot of positives to being able to do that in the field and also reduce overtime because traditionally those were done at end of shift after, say, a body camera had been uploaded. Now the officers could do that when feasible and safe, could add that information into the field. So really combining this body camera approach with a smartphone and creating this connected officer approach to doing policing really kind of changed it and changed the organization, I think, for the better and kind of set us up for all the improvements that have come since.
Really, really like that approach. And for anybody that might have missed it there, I think the takeaway, or at least what I think is the takeaway, is if you're doing a major body camera rollout, or if you're doing a major upgrade or expansion, look at that as an opportunity to perhaps leverage smartphones, because the sheer utility alone really can impact your field operations. So thank you for allowing me that editorial comment there, Dan. But it really was, I think, smart what you did, because it can be tough to justify smartphones, and you did it in such a way that you really showed a win-win, and that's great. So looking back on that project, obviously they all have challenges. What do you know now that you wished you'd known or understood when you began that effort?
Well, we spent a lot of time looking at both policy and infrastructure costs associated with bodyworn, which I think was a big help. We did a lot of planning around that, a lot of testing. So I think that really helped in the deployment. The one thing that I wish I had done better is really when it came to adding the smartphones, there is a lot more that needs to be done rather than just issuing the phone. Certainly you have, just like you have on your, say, your department computers, you have a golden image so you can manage your desktop computers or laptops. Well, you almost have to have the same for your smartphones. You have to customize them so that they work for your organization. You have to ensure that all the different applications that you think you want to use are also available on a smartphone devices. CGIS requirements were certainly on my mind, but I didn't have the kind of working knowledge that I do today when we were deploying them. And I think that's an area that you have to be aware of in terms of security and dual factor authentication. All these words, which were at the time in the early 2000s, were really new, and smartphones were not common, at least at a mass deployment during that time period. So I wish I had known more about it during that time, as well as the entire mobile device management software applications that go with it. How you can ensure you wipe a device. How do you re-enroll a device when you assign it to, say, another officer or someone promotes? And then there's the inevitable upgrade of devices. The beauty, I think personally in our lives, we love when you get a new Samsung device that comes out. You're very excited because of all the new features. But in an organization that has, say, 8,000 smartphones, now you have to change, right? You have to swap all those out. You have to train them on new features. You have to make sure all the upgrades happen and don't break the chain of maybe an application that you rely on every day in the field. That management of the smartphones, very challenging, well worth it. But again, when I started this project, I had no idea it would actually be as time consuming. And I'll even say it was more time consuming than the deployment of the body cameras.
Well said. And I like that you mentioned the MDM, the mobile device management, because a lot of people overlook that even in small agencies, and it's really necessary in an organization. So let's talk about smartphones in terms of the way agencies have been impacted. How do you think, and go beyond LAPD if you would, because I know you interact with a lot of agencies, how has that technology changed the way agencies are policing?
From a officer in the field, it really is the first time, aside from traditionally when we had, say, a connected laptop in the car, this really has allowed officers to get information prior to that, prior to getting in the car. Once they're at a scene and they've secured it and they need to get resources available to them, traditionally we only relied on the radio. And depending on the type of traffic, radio traffic you'd have in your particular area, that could be a challenge. So now you have a cell phone with applications if you need to look up resources. I mean, think of all the things we do in our personal life. That's almost double of what you can expect an officer is going to want to look for, including and up to like translation devices or applications on your smartphone. I mean, it really has allowed officers to be more effective in the way they deal with the community. It allows them to be safer because they're able to get information sooner, which allows them to make better decisions. In any type of police work, it's all about the information you have on hand, your training experience, and your ability to then translate that into an action. And having smartphones quite often allows you to get that information earlier or make better decisions once you're on scene, because you're able to interact directly with either an application or another subject matter expert who's on the other side of that smartphone. So again, it's really changed. I would also say that even over the years, as I look at different cities, as they start to develop their IoT, their 5G capability within their own cities and counties, it also allows smartphones to detect information and get it to the phone. So really, I think we're really scratching the surface of what the Internet of Things is going to do for field applications and how smartphones will interact with all those sensors that are out in the field and provide, again, more information for officers, supervisors, command folks to make solid decisions in a timely fashion.
I like that. And you use the term just scratching the surface. So let's look out toward the horizon a little bit. You've always struck me as maybe a pragmatic futurist, but still, you're always looking down the road quite a bit. What do you see as the future for mobile and emergency services? And if you want to make some comments about our friends in fire, that's fine too.
I think really when you look at public safety as a whole, and when I say that, I always include fire and EMS. And I think the future, a couple of things are going to happen. One, and it's a small thing that's often overlooked, but battery improvement. Battery improvement in smartphones. I mean, all public safety is really challenged with, those very long shifts, right? And we're asking more and more of these devices. So the expansion and capabilities of battery power, I think, are going to be huge for how we interact with them. Also, I think that over the years, the user interface, the UIs for each of these applications have gotten better and more intuitive. And I think that is going to help, and it's going to continue to evolve. And I think you're even going to start to see more gesture related applications, just like in new smartwatches you have where you can pinch and you can make things just by doing gestures of your hands. And that'll free up officers from that inevitable worry you hear. Well, if I have a device in my hand, then I can't get to the other equipment I have on my utility belt, or as a first responder, I need to get my medical kit. That gesture type applications, I think, will start to creep into how we interact with smart devices. And again, I just feel like IoT, all the sensors that are going to start to come in, whether they're on your body, whether they're around you, are really going to start to change how and what information is available to public safety. And I know I use the term already scratch the surface, but I really believe that we are really in the development and infancy stage of technology. It feels like we've had mobile phones in our hands forever, but we really haven't. This is a new experience, I think, for public safety, and it's just going to get stronger. There was a time where having a traditional mobile radio in your hand in order to do communication was considered, gosh, that's so difficult. I don't want that. Now you wouldn't do police work with it or without it. And I think that's where we're going with smartphones. The smartphones are going to and are starting to turn the corner. And you're like, you won't go out and patrol without a radio, or you won't go out and patrol without your body camera. There will be a time where you won't go out and patrol without your smartphone. So I'm excited to see what the future and to be a part of that, to be honest.
Yes, it is a great time in terms of technology as a force multiplier for public safety. You mentioned radios right there towards the end of your response. So before I move on to the question I had planned, let's touch on that for just a minute. Do you see smartphones as emerging as an alternative or an augmentation to our traditional LMR approach? What do you think?
I think it already is an augmentation to our LMR approach. I think that agencies are starting to take some of their traditional radio traffic and transferring it to smart devices, either through dedicated applications or just to simply call their dispatcher communication to get additional resources or additional information. So I think that natural evolution has already started. Now, whether it becomes a replacement for it, there's still challenges out there. There's still some things that LMR does really well. And there's still applications, especially for the fire side of the house, where there are conditions inside a structure that's on fire and some of the requirements that they have for operating, especially with gloves and some of the emergency equipment that they're required to wear. LMR is still traditionally suited for those. Over time, will this start to change? I believe so. I think there's still a role for LMR today and will continue to be there for a while, but that blurring of the two functions and finding ways of applying them will continue to grow, because I think the best indicators are from the field personnel. As they get more confidence in the fact that when they need to communicate, they'll always be able to get somebody on the other line. It will work with all the other pieces of equipment that they have, that it will help them in their day-to-day activity. They will naturally start to progress over to whatever the best technology that fits that application. And so if going back to my analogy with the car manufacturers, if competition and need continues to push it and providers continue to provide it, then officers will naturally ask and demand that as part of their public safety role. And as long as the manufacturers and networks hear that and continue to develop it in that direction, then I do see this natural evolution of the two merging, and then we'll see which one comes out on top at the end.
So, what would your recommendations be for agency leaders who are just beginning to engage with mobile more effectively, and they kind of like to know how to best roll this out, how to get up to speed and take full advantage of it? What would your recommendations be?
Well, I think the first thing is I would recommend is to talk to other organizations and agencies who have done this. There's no sense in reinventing the wheel. There are very, very good agencies, both big, small, and even on the federal level, who have implemented these types of programs. Talk to them. My experience has been, and even one who gets these calls all the time, we're willing to talk about them. We're willing to tell you and share our plans, our policies, all the things that we've done and all the mistakes, quite frankly, that we've made along the way, that so you don't have to do it. And that you can then, as an organization, develop a solid plan, both not just from an implementation and policy perspective, but there's also a big financial piece to this, right? There's budgeting, and then there's reoccurring costs associated with all this. Learn from every agency, understand how they did their procurement and why. And you can put a nice package together so that when you are either elevating this within your own command or to whichever government body oversees your organization, and you're trying to justify this move towards smart technology, that you're able to present a package that makes a lot of sense and that'll help you get to your end goal, which is deploy and get this into the hands of your first responders. I think that would be the first and foremost. I think the second thing is, once you've started to go down that road, I think you have to engage all your stakeholders, not just within your organization, but outside your organization, in city government, in IT, in the community. Again, having that holistic approach to something helps you check those boxes and make sure that you don't miss anything along the way. So I definitely believe that it's something that has to be considered as you move forward. And then quite frankly, it doesn't stop once you get the product, whatever it is you're trying to implement, whether it be a body camera or a smartphone type application. This is ongoing. You have to continue, because technology constantly evolves, changes, new capabilities become available. And so you have to continue that dialogue both inside the organization with those outside partners and your stakeholders in your community. So again, once you start, realize that it's not just a one and done. It's going to be a continuous process.
Yeah, you nailed it right there at the end. It's kind of a broad brush description, but it's a journey rather than a destination, right?
It is. And if I could just add one thing, Dale, it's as you go down this, documentation is so important, because every organization that I've ever talked to, big or small, there quite often is a champion. And in LAPD, me and my team, we were the champions of technology, but people promote, people retire, people move on to other roles. And having a solid foundation of documentation allows the next supervisor who comes in, the next project manager to come in, to pick up right where you left off and keep it going within the organization. Quite often I've seen projects rely on just one very motivated person, but when that person retires or moves on, there's a drop off or a pause in that program. So development of a structure that allows this to move forward, I think, is also really important.
I'm going to throw one more to you before we close out. We've talked about planning and rolling out programs and mobile. And one of the things I think that is sometimes overlooked is the need in the RFP process to tell your incoming vendor, or to make a requirement for vendors, since an agency wants to go mobile, that the application, this primarily applies, I guess, to CAD and RMS, that the application be capable of being used on mobile. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree 100%. If as an organization that is your end goal, then everything that you do an RFP for, it should include that type of language. And not only should it include it, but it should be very specific. not only in terms of capability, but you should also be specific to if you have specific programs that they have to integrate into, you have to ensure that they include language around APIs. If there's certain operating systems that you work in, you have to ensure that they're compatible with those APIs. There's certain access information. If there's certain, like for instance, you have to know when someone logs into something, you have to ensure that all that data is included both in your desktop application and in your mobile environment. And that language should be clear. And then they should also, in any sort of RFP, require a demonstration that they're not only can they do it, but they should also demonstrate that they can do it. Because quite often the language in RFPs, and this is, I love all the lawyers that get involved, the language is such where they say that they're capable of it, but that doesn't mean that they're able to do it today. That means sometimes that is code for we're working on it. And now that you wrote it down, we're going to try to get it to you. So that's okay too, as long as they tell you that. And as you look from vendor to vendor, you're able to compare apples to apples versus apples to oranges, right? Have them show you. And if they can't, and you're willing to wait for that development because the other parts of the RFP are, very strong, then at least you know that going in. But that should be part of your requirement as a demonstration.
I really appreciate the way you summed that up. I think so much of what you said will be really, really helpful to people who are in the midst of a project or looking at starting a project. It's that old adage of eating an elephant, right? You got to do it one bite at a time. So Dan, thank you so, so much for your time. This will conclude today's podcast from Mobile Technology Spotlight. It's been sponsored by Samsung Electronics of America and proudly presented by Public Safety Insight. Stay safe out there, everyone.